So we're right here at a little after 10 o'clock. I'm going to go ahead and start the recording, and we're going to kick things off here. I've got a few introductory slides, and then we're going to launch pretty quickly into Patrick's presentation, and Patrick's joining us. Patrick has a hard stop at 11, and we have, of course, a picnic coming up next Sunday. So we wanted to make today's meeting an abbreviated meeting relative to announcements and relative to our overall program. I wanted to kick off by the slide I'm sharing now. Reminder of even last month's meeting, at which this is the time to be particularly thoughtful about invasive species, upon which Patrick's going to be talking to us at length about. But a shout out to the Washington Invasive Species Council and their website, and the urgent request for community science and community contributions to any sightings of some of these pests, some of which we'll be talking about today. Also wanted to do a shout out on Patrick's behalf about an upcoming West Side Fall Forestry Day on September 27th. It's a full day. It's up in Eatonville. I encourage you to check out what's being offered on that day schedule. There's a lot of great topics up here that relate to us. Biochars being talked about, obviously invasives, culturing techniques for trees and such. Patrick will say a little bit more about it, but a shout out to this Fall Forestry Day coming up at the end of the month. Okay. So as we get into today, a reminder that I'm going to push briefly through our announcements and through our activities here today, so that we can get to Patrick early on to talk about the emerald ash borer and what we as master gardeners need to do relative to understanding this pest and how we can engage with the public on this. A lot of things happening here in September. As you can see on the calendar, we had our training session on the 7th. We've got we're meeting today on the 10th. Our board meeting is tonight at 5 p.m. So note the special time for the board meeting at 5 p.m. tonight. We wanted to make sure that we were finished ahead of the debate, which many of us are interested in watching this evening. So 5 p.m., everyone is welcome to join. We have the picnic is on Sunday. That's in the details are in the e-news relative to the potluck. At 11:30 a.m. at Terry's up on Rustemeyer Road, just outside of Aberdeen. Study group, also noted in the e-news, picks up next Monday the 16th, at the Elma Demo Garden. And instructions are in the e-news relative to lichens and relative to the materials that you're requested to bring along. Of course, we got a GGH meeting on the 21st of the month and the Advanced Education Conference coming at the very end of the month, the 27th and the 28th. So a very busy month relative to calendar activities. Looking ahead to October, our October meeting will be on the 9th. That's the second Tuesday, of course, which I don't know why I have it it's on the Tuesday the 8th, so it shouldn't be on Wednesday the 9th. My apologies for screwing up the calendar there. But the point I wanted to get it to the slide here is that October is our elections month. October is the month at which we, as a foundation, elect our officers for the following year. So our 2024 board, both regionally and across the two-county foundation, we will be electing our roles for the follow-on year. So more will be coming on that. But a heads up now, for this is your time to be thinking about elections and when that and what we want to be thinking about ahead of that. Looking ahead one more month into November, as noted in the e-news, right? Saturday, the 16th of November will be our annual recognition event. That'll be held at the Log Cabin Pavilion up in Aberdeen. So heads up in terms of that coming up in the month ahead, in the 2 months ahead. So get those dates on the calendar now. So with that, reminder then, in terms of going back to the elections of who we are. So as master gardeners, we all are part of the WSU extension program for master gardeners, and we are credentialed by WSU extension. We go through our continuing education, our program support hours, and we abide by the precepts of the program. As a foundation, right, we are a nonprofit corporation that supports the program through our fundraising activities and through our outreach programs. Perhaps sometimes our outrageous outreach programs, right? If you'll forgive my flub of the vocabulary there. But as part of that, then that means we have to have elections. Now, as Lori points out in the e-news, in order to be eligible to vote in our elections or to serve on the board, you need to be a member, a dues paying member of the foundation. The dues are not this is a formality, but it is a formality that's required by Washington state law. Washington state law says that as a nonprofit, you can't automatically enroll individuals into your nonprofit. They have to opt in. They have to demonstrate their willingness to become a member of the foundation in order to have the rights to vote. And so that is why, as Lori points out in the e-news, it's important that you make a conscious decision to join and pay dues to the foundation. So I wanted to make sure that it's clear that we simply are not trying to be restrictive or exclusive in in that, but it is just it's a function of state law that pushes us to require dues membership for voting. So really quick, any announcements and other program notes that we want to reach out and have shared with the group here today? Anyone?
I do. I just want to do a shout out for the second annual Dahlia show at the Columbia Pacific Heritage Museum this coming Friday and Saturday. And as I was there both days last year, it is phenomenal. It's beautiful, beautiful. Single petaled dahlias to the dinner plate dahlias, and make a day of it. We've got a new business in downtown Ilwaco. It's the Ilwaco Cider Company. Kelly and I've been there. They have delightful ciders made out of cranberries, which is interesting. And across the street from the museum is a really nice little cafe called the Ebb Cafe, and it's still Ilwaco Saturday Market. So make a day of it. Come on down to see the Dahlia show and hang out in Ilwaco.
Bev is the hospitality director for the city of Ilwaco, apparently, that's for sure.
She's got a good sell there.
That's a good sell. Terry makes the point that the picnic is at 1 p.m., not 11:30 p.m., so it's at 1 p.m. on Sunday. Okay, so yeah, Terry, yeah. You're still on mute there, Terry.
Well, that's the time I've heard, and that's what's in e-news under the calendar.
Well, and since you are the hostess, I think we should abide by, coming by at 1 o'clock. That's for sure.
I think it has to do with members who go to church in the morning.
There you go. There you go. So for the morally just and righteous amongst us, right? For sure. So that they can.
Yes.
And excuse me, this is Elizabeth, and I would just like to add one comment. I have had a number of folks ask me, can spouses come? And I, of course, said, of course they can come.
Yeah. Right.
So,
and one who may bring a child.
Oh, that's fun. That's great.
So 1 p.m. this Sunday, right? This coming Sunday. Thank you for the corrections. Other announcements, other program announcements. Okay. So again, I want to thank things. I want a quick reminder, of course, that the state conference is coming up on the 27th and 28th of this end of this month. There's it's all virtual this year, right? So the opportunity and the opportunity of signing up and registering for the conference gives you access not only to the conference sessions that are going on as they occur in live session, but also to the recordings afterwards. So again, as we've been saying all along, there's no excuse for missing our continuing education hours this year, given the virtual access to the conference. So the website is up there, mglearns.org.
Okay. Also, Kelly.
Yeah, Karen, go ahead. Whoop. Karen, you want to try again?
Everybody. Yeah. for
Karen,
that.
you cut out, Karen. Can you repeat again? Can you start it again?
The annual meeting and the awards ceremony for the at the annual conference is open to everybody, and it's going to have a different Zoom.
Yeah.
And I think it looked to me like the invitation came out today. I just haven't explored it from Jennifer.
That is correct. So I would encourage everyone to take a peek at your email today, because Jennifer McKee from the state conference has pushed out an email regarding that particular meeting and that Zoom link in an email today.
Yeah, it's a different Zoom link than the conference.
Okay. Thanks.
Everybody's invited. You don't have to go to the conference to attend that meeting. And it's also virtual.
Very good. Any other announcements? Any other announcements from anyone today? Very good. Well, we're going to jump right into things here. I'm going to go ahead and stop my share, Patrick, and turn this over to you. And because we're thrilled, by the way, you're able to join us here today. And it very much look forward to you sharing. I know that I have a number of ash trees myself, and so I'm very keen on understanding how this particular pest needs to be managed in light of all the other concerns we have regarding climate change, invasive pest, drought, and other stresses that our trees are going under. So thank you for joining us here today. Take it away.
No, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay?
Thumbs up.
And are you seeing the correct screen?
Forest pest in Washington.
Okay, just want to make sure you're not seeing my notes screen. I know sometimes that gets swapped around, but yeah, thank you for inviting me. I really enjoy coming and giving these talks. I think when it comes to invasive species in particular, our master gardeners play a really critical role. So I am always willing to come and talk about this because they're truly devastating pests and truly worrisome. So what I like to do in this talk, and I will try to keep it as brief as possible so that we can leave plenty of time for questions. But I like to start by giving a foundation of forest health and what we mean by that. And the reason for that is, especially with master gardeners, you're often working in that nexus between sort of landscape settings and forest settings, where in a landscape setting, individual trees receive a lot of attention. And in a forest setting, we're treating forests as an aggregate. And when you treat forests as an aggregate of different organisms, the approach is very much different, very, very different. In fact, I know very little about, I'm commonly mistaken for knowing a lot about landscape trees, and I don't. So I'm always pushing people towards master gardeners for that kind of stuff because my training is in forest ecology, and forest health. So, and it is important to understand that, a group of trees as small as even a half acre or so, quarter acre even, can start to behave and function as a forest and moves away from that sort of landscape context into more of a forestry approach. So even in small acreages, which we are dealing with more and more, especially in this part of the world, are should be treated as forests. So what you'll leave with today is an understanding of tree mortality and what we might call good or normal tree mortality versus bad, and the role of native pests in that versus the role of invasive pests. We'll also give a primer on invasive pest ecology, and I will mention a number of different invasive pests that we're sort of on the watch for in Washington or what's present. But I'm really going to spend the time on emerald ash borer because that's what I'm most familiar with. And it seems to be the most pressing one at the moment. All right, so a quick primer on forest ecology and health. So one of the ways that we look at a forest is through forest stand development. And this just describes how stand forest structure and appearance changes over time. And forest health is going to look different in different stages. Often these stages are referred to as sears. You don't necessarily need to know that term, but sometimes it will be referred to as early seral, which would be a young forest like what you see down here. This is what we call early sterile habitat versus late sterile, where this is more of a mature, not quite old growth forest, but just later sterile, later in the stage of development of forest. So we'll run through all these four stages of stand development and describe how changes occur and how mortality occurs in these. So if you imagine, 1,000 acres got severely burned by a fire or logged or some sort of really a heavy disturbance that sort of resets the vegetation on that landscape, we would be starting over at the beginning stage of stand development. And that's what we call stand initiation. Pretty intuitive, exactly what it sounds like. It's the establishment of a new cohort of trees. It occurs after a major disturbance. We're typically getting what we call pioneer species coming back on the landscape at this stage. These are species that really require a lot of light and maybe bare mineral soil to get established. So your cottonwoods, your alders, your Doug firs, even. And they tend to be a little less shade intolerant. Now, that's what would occur naturally nowadays, especially if we're logging, we're legally required to come back and replant. So you have much more influence over the species that occur at that stage and sort of how they're spaced as well, but still referred to as stand initiation. Now, as those trees grow up, they'll often grow up in they'll get established at a really high density, right? If we're planting, it's pretty standard to plant at around 400 trees by acre. The industry standard is like 10 by 10 if you're looking at a conifer plantation. But even naturally, you would get a lot of seedlings coming in, a lot more than is ultimately going to survive as the stand develops. So you come into this stage of what we call stem exclusion, and you have really high stand density, you're getting canopy closure and higher competition for sunlight between these species. And as a result of that density and canopy closure, you're seeing significant competition and significant mortality, really significant mortality. In many cases, 50% or more of your trees are dying in order to make room for the remaining trees that are going to continue to make up that forest. And it's a period of what we would call self-thinning naturally. And industry or forest management contexts, we're often doing the thinning. But here, native pests and disease play a really important role because they're the agents of that self-thinning. Root rots, bark beetles often are the ones that are coming in and they're thinning out the weak trees, and the stronger ones are able to survive and defend themselves because they were there first or had a slight edge genetically, whatever reason, they're able to establish themselves. So this is the ecology that our native pests fit into, and so really need to be thought of in a very different context compared to invasive pests. Now, I will take a step back and say that doesn't mean that native pests can't be troublesome. They can be, and there are situations where that occurs. But by and large, they are far less of a worry than are invasive pests. So after that, after that period of pretty significant mortality, you get into what we call maturity, where there's less mortality and competition. There's always going to be some, but it's less. You're not losing, half of your trees or anything like that. Relatively uninhibited growth in that first cohort of trees. And then you start to get the establishment of shade-tolerant understory trees. And these are the trees that are going to kind of wait for those overstory trees to die off, and then they're going to take over in the canopy. And that's what we call succession because it describes a change in species over time in a forest. And then eventually, after a very, very long time, you get old growth. And that's when that pioneer cohort starts to die. You get all this dead, downed wood on the ground. You have these gap dynamics where those trees died and other trees are moving in, and you get you move away from having one age class or two age classes or cohorts, what you might say, into having just this broad spectrum of age classes. You've got trees that are 40 years old, trees that are 250 years old, trees that are 10 years old. There's no really distinct cohorts at the point of old growth. It takes a really long time to get to old growth around here. Often people mistake mature for old growth. And there are some distinctive qualities.
Yeah, there definitely are.
So, this is all that ask the question, can a healthy forest have dead trees? And the answer is a resounding yes. And not just can it have, it should have. Forest health means dead trees, right? We need some trees to die for others to continue to survive. Also, dead wood plays a really critical role in a lot of forest functions in building soil. Something like 70% of vertebrate wildlife rely and invertebrate wildlife rely on dead wood for part of their functions and habitat or food, hunting, that kind of stuff. So dead wood is really critical to a forest. If you have a forest without a lot of dead trees and dead wood, you might not have a very healthy forest. You can have too much too, though. So it's always a balance and a fine line. So how do we differentiate between normal disturbance and mortality and what we would call a disruption to forest health? Well, first, when your management goals are affected, if you as a landowner, someone that's managing this land, have goals, whether those goals are timber, recreation and aesthetics, special forest products, wildlife habitat, when whatever is happening is deviating from those goals, that's when you might start to think about doing something. We also think about when ecosystem services are lost, which are also considered forest functions. So the ability of a forest to provide clean water and air and sequester carbon and provide wildlife habitat. If these things are being lost, then we want to think about how we can apply some management tactics to recover them. And when normal forest development is disrupted, one of the examples I always give is we've all seen forests with lots of English ivy, growing on the ground, that carpet of ivy. And I know of quite a few landowners that actually like that. They think it looks really neat. But the problem with that is, it doesn't allow anything to get established underneath. And so when those overstory trees die, it's just going to turn into a big ivy blanket. There's nothing there to take the place of those trees. So the development has been disrupted. And then we also think about a lack of resilience to other changes, other forest pests. These are things we want as well when in a healthy forest. So I'm transitioning now to talk about and give an example of a native forest pest. Like I mentioned, bark beetles they're very scary. A lot of times we see a lot of news about, bark beetle outbreaks, absolutely devastating forests. And I want to start by saying, first things first, Western Washington is a different animal when it comes to bark beetles. We have some of the best tree-growing country in the world. And for that reason, our trees are often able to defend themselves from bark beetles. And so whereas you have dry interior mountain forests like lodgepole pine and pine beetles there, where you see this really massive devastation, and a lot of that is related to climate change and milder winters and other factors are also responsible. Where there, beetles can be kind of a primary pest and take down otherwise healthy trees. Here, we consider bark beetles a secondary pest. So those trees already have to be facing some sort of stressor like drought or root rot or something like that for a bark beetle to move in and kind of finish the job. So they're only really attacking weakened trees. And as a result, this is kind of what a bark beetle outbreak looks like in Western Washington. You got a few clusters of trees dying, and it kind of peters out as the population breaks over a few years. Now, and the reason for that is these trees can actually defend themselves if they have the right amount of resources. They can basically pitch out sap to kind of extirpate the beetles as they're trying to drill in, or they can actually, close off the wound that they cause and then just recover that way. So there's a lot of defensive tactics that they have. And in terms of identification, we won't spend too much time on this, but it's pretty easy to tell a bark beetle death. Most people don't see it until it's this stage is the thing, because not a lot of people are out there with magnifying glasses looking for tiny holes and sawdust on their trees. But a lot of times you'll be driving down the road or walking in your woods, you'll see a tree that's got bright red foliage, which means it died really suddenly. And that is an indicator of bark beetles. So there are situations where bark beetles do get out of control in Western Washington, and a lot of times they are after wind throw events. When you have a lot of fresh, green, defenseless, down dead wood, so basically just a lot of food for the beetles to just go nuts and build up lots of populations, that's when you see pretty big beetle outbreaks in Washington. And why it would be important to go into something like this and kind of chop it up into firewood lengths to help kind of dry that wood out and reduce those populations. But ultimately, those bark beetle populations are going to peak and decline and not really sustain. The other thing I would say is no one here, unless you're like a trained certified arborist or something, should ever go into this and start cutting this up because there's incredible tension in these trees. People get hurt. Don't ever do that. Call a professional. But if you are concerned about wind throw and the amount of fresh wood being in there and a bark beetle outbreak, cutting that wood up, helping it dry out is a good way to reduce the amount of cycles and generations of beetles that can grow in that. But again, this is all in the context of a native pest ecology because our trees can defend themselves. They evolved to defend themselves from these pests, or at least coexist with them. So we're looking at an aggregate of trees, and if that stand is in its self-thinning stage and we're losing a lot to bark beetles, well, that could just be a part of its development. We don't necessarily need to go in and do anything. Now, there are tons of other Washington, native forest pests, be they fungi or insects or what have you, mistletoes even, all kinds of stuff that wants to kind of munch on your trees and maybe in some situations even kill your trees, but generally not necessarily worth spending a lot of sleepless nights over. One exception is that some are being exacerbated by climate change and drought. I won't go into that in too much detail, but really the primary stressor is drought. Again, it's important to remember that, not the pest itself. So the DNR does a lot of really great work on this. They literally go up in a plane and they monitor every inch of forest land. They fly over. I know the guy that does this. Flies over all the forest land, marks all the dead trees. They go and they ground truth a lot of it. And then they come up with this forest health highlights where they look at how these mostly native forest pests are progressing. These breakouts, come over years and then decline. And so these forest health highlights can be a really good way to kind of check in on the overall forest health in the state and what certain pests might be doing. All right, so now on to invasive pests. And I know I'm kind of speaking to the choir here. I'm sure a lot of you understand the ecology of invasive insects, but just to get everyone on the same page, the reason that invasive pests are so devastating to native ecosystems is that they have evolved in different ecosystems with different prey and different predators. So they are coming into a new playground with, sometimes all the advantages in the world. So most of the time, it's actually with very few advantages. Despite the damage that invasive pests have caused not just in the US, but around the world, there's something called the 1% rule that I like to tell. You can just kind of help people keep in mind is that of the introduced species, I think this is true for both plants and insects and diseases, only about 10% establish successfully, and only 10% of those go on to be invasive and cause any sort of significant damage. So that's what we call the 1% rule. 1% of all species that actually travel to new ecosystems actually establish and become a problem. But those that do cause a drastic amount of damage. So it's just interesting to think about that portion. So really you're just kind of, it almost feels like a lot of luck or unluckiness really of happening to have that one species that evolved in a different ecosystem and for whatever reason coming to this ecosystem gives it all the advantages in the world. And emerald ash borer is a really good example of that, and I will be talking about that in more detail. But generally what's happening is you're introducing it to a new ecosystem where prey have not evolved any defenses. There are fewer predators, and this allows them to flourish. In most cases, eradication is just not feasible. So instead, you're banking on long-term naturalization. And there's a lot of different tactics, including introducing biocontrol agents. So introducing some of the predators it has where it came from, facilitating genetic resistance, and trying to slow the spread. So there are some invasive pests already present in Washington. And for further context, I grew up in Michigan. That's where I was trained in forestry. I've been out here for about 7 years. Back there and in the East in general, the invasive species problem is way worse than it is out here. For whatever reason, the Pacific Northwest in particular has been largely buffered from a lot of the damage of invasive insects and disease, not necessarily plants, but invasive insects and disease for forest health. One previous example, though, is white pine blister rust, which is an invasive fungi that spread through the country in the 1800s. And it's the reason we don't really see a lot of white pine in Western Washington anymore. It used to be all over Southwest Washington. Now it's kind of relegated to drier sites where that fungus doesn't do as well. So if you think about the kind of scale of damage from just one invasive pest. So emerald ash borer is not technically known to be present in Washington, but it has been present in Oregon for 2 years at least, probably more, and it's now present in British Columbia. It's very likely that it is here in Washington. We just don't know it yet. So we're also on the watch for a number of different insects. Spongy moth, formerly known as gypsy moth. That has been found in Washington a few times and successfully eradicated. Elongate hemlock scale affects hemlocks. Asian longhorn beetle is on the watch. That has a pretty wide host range. It affects a wide group of trees. Sudden oak death has also been found and eradicated in Washington, but it's continued to be monitored for. Mediterranean oak borer is a new one that just established in California and could also affect our oaks. And then spotted lanternfly is another one that has a pretty wide host range and more implications for agriculture than forestry, but still certainly on the watch for our trees. So on to emerald ash borer, a little bit of background. It's from China. It established in Detroit in the mid 1990s, was identified in 2002. It actually was found in Garden City, Michigan, which is just about, half hour from where I grew up. It's a secondary pest in Asia, like how our bark beetles are. There it's, it evolved with pests and prey, and it's kept in check there, but it is devastating to Fraxinus species in North America. So that's really important, is that it only affects Fraxinus, true ash trees. Anything in the Fraxinus genus is going to be affected. Olive trees are a loose cousin of ash trees, so in the Olea genus. And they can be affected by emerald ash borer as well, but my understanding is they usually don't die. So since 2002, when it was spotted in Michigan, it has now spread to 35 states and 5 Canadian provinces. It's the most devastating insect in U.S. history. It damages significant in urban and para-urban areas because ash trees are really popular landscape trees. And we're seeing, so I say up to 95%, that's kind of the average across species. For some species, it's 99 to 100% mortality. So this is a very effective tree killer. So we'll talk about its life cycle a little bit. Adults emerge in the spring. Beetle activity peaks in midsummer. On really warm days is when you'd be out there and you would actually see them flying if they're there. They feed on the ash foliage, but that's not really how they cause damage. The main damage is caused when females bore into the tree, lay their eggs on the cambium and phloem, those inner layers of the tree. And then those larvae hatch and they feed on that and eventually girdling the tree. So females can mate multiple times, produce up to 200 eggs each time. It's a really prolific reproducer. And the adults typically fly up to 2 miles in a season. So it's important to understand that for how they spread. There is different host preference and different mortality rates among different types of ash. In Washington, we have a number of ornamental ash trees around, but we only have one native ash, and that's Oregon ash, and that is expected to be very susceptible. We're expecting somewhere 95 to 100% mortality based on some previous studies. So one thing too, and again, probably preaching to the choir here, but not everyone knows how to properly identify an ash tree. So it is really important because, things that are colloquially called ash, like mountain ash, are not actually ash trees and they won't be affected by this at all. An ash tree has opposite arrangement. So that's kind of the first thing I point people towards. I don't know if I have a better picture here. So that means that the leaves and the buds are arranged directly opposite of each other on the twig. And for trees, like full-grown trees, not a lot of hardwoods actually have that arrangement around here, at least native species. The only other example would be big leaf maple, and obviously those leaves look really different. The leaves are compound, so that means this is all one leaf, and it's 5 to 7 different leaflets. And then it produces this single wing samara, kind of like a helicopter seed, but a little more straight and narrow. I like to also I'd be able to identify in the winter, and I always tell people the buds look like chocolate chips. They look like a little Nestle's chocolate chip. There are a lot of lookalikes. Walnut has a compound leaf, but it's not going to be oppositely arranged. Mountain ash, tree of heaven, elderberry, these also all have these compound leaves with leaflets, but they won't be oppositely arranged. So I always point people towards that. How are they arranged on the stem? Because not a lot of things have that arrangement. Emerald ash borer itself, the bug, is really quite beautiful. Agrillis planipennis. It's in the Buprestid family, which is the metallic borer family. And if you ever just want to go look at pictures and geek out about bugs, the Buprestid family is actually really pretty. There's just a lot of really cool bugs. And you know, despite all the damage it does, you can kind of admire how beautiful it is. It's about a third to a half inch long, so not very big, really quite small. It's very long and skinny, almost kind of bullet shaped. Obviously metallic emerald green color, but under it you'll usually see hints of copper, so its belly will be kind of copper colored. It has this somewhat cylindrical shape if you're looking at it in the face. But the problem here too is there are a lot of lookalikes. The Oregon Department of Agriculture released this. I really like this publication or this handout because it really demonstrates how many lookalikes there are. If you aren't working with emerald ash borer a lot, you could pretty easily mistake something for it. But at the same time, if you look at the size and the shape, you know, you can start telling it apart from something like these metallic wood boring beetles that are actually kind of common. I've gotten quite a few pictures. I think the green click beetle looks really close. It could be kind of difficult. But there's other ways to find out, and it's most likely you're not going to just run into a beetle and think, oh, this is emerald ash borer. You're going to run into an ash tree with symptoms. And those symptoms are pretty, you know, it can be kind of tricky because they look a little bit like drought. And that's something I'm running into is I'm seeing trees and like, oh gosh, is that drought? Especially along I-5. Like, should I pull off on the highway and check this out, or does it just look like drought? So what happens first, and this is a unique thing about emerald ash borer, is that it works from the top of the tree down. And this really puts us at a disadvantage. Most trees work and they go right to the stem, right where all the good stuff is. I don't really know what the strategy is or why they go top down. But what that means is by the time that they're working at eye level, the damage is too far gone to save that tree. And the symptoms have kind of a lag after the damage. It could be 1 to 2 years before you're really seeing this canopy dieback and top down damage. You know, by the time you see this, the beetles are probably already working down on the main stems. That makes it kind of difficult to you know, be on top of it and spot them early. But as I said, canopy dieback, top-down damage, these epicormic shoots, which maybe some of you may be familiar with. This is a tree attempting to rebuild its canopy from below, and that's not normal. Trees rebuild, you know, they build their canopy from where the canopy is. That's the most efficient way to do it. But this is the tree's kind of alarm system saying, I'm experiencing canopy dieback, so I got to put more canopy out from below. And that's not a healthy sign. So when you see this, you know that tree is under significant stress. Longer term, you would see bark splitting, and then under the bark, you would start to see some of these serpentine larval galleries. And you'll see that the galleries start small and then they get bigger as the larvae get fatter and you know, healthier, so to speak. But one of the easiest ways to spot emerald ash borer is this D-shaped exit hole. Some of you may have heard of this before. Flat on one side and then circular on the other side. So this is very unique to emerald ash borer. No other species does this. If you're seeing D-shaped exit holes and they're really clear on the tree, if you're not sure if it's D-shaped, it's probably not. because I mean, you go out and look at these, and it is a pretty clear D. And that this is most often how people find them. Once they see, they'll see the damage in the tree first, and then the identification becomes pretty clear based on those D-shaped exit holes. All right, so let's talk about impacts, and we really divide this up between urban spaces and forested spaces, natural spaces. So in urban spaces, we're dealing mostly with ornamental ash. Again, there's all kinds of different, Chinese ash, crimson ash, golden ash, all these different ash trees. Some cities have as high as 30% ash coverage in their canopy. Lacey, here where I am, has something like a third of their urban trees are ash trees. So they will experience significant damage to their what we would call green infrastructure. And this can have pretty serious effects, increased heat bubble, loss of stormwater mitigation, increase in hazard trees, and then you have all of the costs of removal associated with that, reduced property value, right? Trees add value to properties. So that's where a lot of that economic damage comes from, is the cost of removal or maintenance and, reduced property value. And then there's also the course, the potential for injury and damage, especially in low income communities where they might not be able to pay to have those trees removed. Then we're running into potential, damage to structures or people. And then, of course, there's the costs of ash treatment, which I'll talk about afterwards. In forested settings, Oregon ash is a very niche species. It grows in places that no other species can grow in some situations. Even willow sometimes can't handle the amount of water that ash can. So it's really going to be difficult to find a replacement species for it when we see significant mortality, which could result in increased temperatures in riparian areas, because again, it's mostly growing in wetlands or along very still waters, riverbanks, things like that, where fish really need a lot of shade for their habitat. We can see loss of soil stabilization, changes in hydrology because we're losing all these trees that pump water up into the air, and potential spread of invasive species on the ground. What happens when you cut any forest down in Washington? You get blackberry and you get Scotch broom and you get all these other things. So there could be really significant effects in both urban and forested settings. In terms of management, there are options. I do not have a license in insecticides, so I cannot give specific recommendations, but I really like this publication for that. But I can say that there are systemic insecticidal options, which means you inject them into the tree, that they found to be incredibly effective at reducing or at preventing emerald ash borer from getting in the tree. Once they're in the tree, it's usually a little too late unless you get them right when they start. But in urban, it's really only available for urban and landscape settings, right? Because at scale in a forest, it would just be too costly. So, the story I like to tell is I had a tree house in an ash tree growing up in Michigan, and we decided to actually treat that tree, and it was something like $100 every 2 years. And I don't know how those prices have changed, more expensive, less expensive, I don't know. But there are options out there to protect individual high value trees. And even at scales, we've seen whole cities decide, what, it's actually, when you look at the benefits that these trees provide to our city, it's actually worth spending that money and treating thousands of trees every 2 to 3 years to keep them alive rather than trying to like plant all new trees and deal with those effects. In forested settings, we use what's called integrated SLAM management, which stands for slowing ash mortality. We're not preventing ash mortality because emerald ash borer is just too powerful for that, but we can slow it enough to give us options and hopefully replant and avoid a situation where a wetland is completely denuded of forest cover. So that's kind of what we're hoping for there. The biggest thing you can do as individuals is spread the message of not moving firewood. So if we look at the state of Michigan, Garden City, just outside of Detroit, if we thought that the beetle only spread by flying 2 miles every year, it's only been 22 years. It should have only gone 50 months, or so. But what really spread was moving ash firewood. We would see hot spots at campsites. That's really how this spread so quickly to other places. So that's why we say buy it where you burn it. That's one of my favorite. Actually, you don't see that here. Oh yeah, you do. Yeah, buy it where you burn it. I think that's a really great move. I know, and it's good for not just emerald ash borer, but it's just good practice in general. Moving untreated plant material can cause a lot of problems with whatever next invasive species we might be dealing with. So I really encourage people, if you're going to be camping and you want to have some campfires, buy your firewood there. I always like to say support your local forest owner and his roadside firewood stand. And that's really important because you can see how quickly it spread here, largely because of people moving firewood. So there's a number of efforts underway to track and monitor and support people slowing ash mortality and understanding what's going on. So Washington and Oregon both have emerald ash borer task forces. There is extension forestry programming and resources mentioned. I've got a couple of publications on the next slide that I think Kelly already sent out, maybe. But there's also a webinar that Kevin Zobrist and I conducted last spring, I think, that kind of covers a lot of these points as well. There's also a really great program out of WSU called Forest Health Watch, led by Molly Dar and Joey Hulbert. And they're watching the idea there is citizen science, using citizen science to track and monitor a bunch of different forest health issues. So that includes a lot of these climate-driven stuff around like cedar decline and big leaf maple decline, but also invasive species as well. So there's lots out there. And I also think, again, master gardeners can play a really critical role when it comes to identification and monitoring for the spread of emerald ash borer. These are two WSU extension publications fresh off a peer review that I recommend. And I think, again, Kelly sent those links out already. And again, this one is great when you're talking to people about what are their options in terms of insecticides for protecting their trees from emerald ash borer. Okay, I think I went a little longer than I wanted, but I do have some time for questions here, if that's okay, Kelly.
This is great stuff, Patrick. Huge appreciation.
Hmm.
First, I want to I certainly have my own list of questions, but I want to open it up. What other questions and comments do we have here for Patrick? I wanted to begin just in particular with respect to some of the comments that I was making here about the importance of dead trees, right? We see as master gardeners so many people moving in to the community, coming from out of state, who really have no appreciation for the importance of snags and dead trees, right? For wildlife. And so it's just I'm appalled by the folks that come in, particularly from California, that want to clean up the forest, right? Clean
Yeah.
up their neighborhood, right? And take down all those dead trees. Jude,
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead, please.
Well, I just say, yeah, I see that a lot too, and I think the motivation for them often, especially if they're coming from California, they could be particularly scarred by experiences with fire, and downwood is fuel. But Western Washington has a very specific fire ecology, so it just takes education, and there is a fine line, right? There's a tightrope walk between down dead wood and the habitat it provides, and understanding fuels and wildfire resilience. But we certainly don't want our forest, spick and span. We want them messy.
Jude, you have your hand up.
I do. I have a couple of questions. Are you trying to educate the towns in the state who also, like Lacey, have a large number of ash trees in their streets? Because facing the temperature increases that we have to suffer, we lose our trees, our shade in the cities, it's going to be infinitely worse. So is there an outreach for those guys, or are you just hoping they'll catch on?
Yeah, well, that's not really my role, but the DNR has a Department of Urban and Community Forestry, and they work very closely with towns in this regard. And they're part of that Emerald Ash Borer Task Force, and I know that they are doing that outreach. They've already worked with cities like Vancouver and Lacey, and so that is happening. I'm not responsible for that, but I do agree with you. And it's one of those situations where, again, it could make sense to actually pay to treat those trees and keep them up rather than, letting them die or replacing them.
Yes, good. I have another question too. Thank you for that answer. You're any successful predator is not going to kill off everything that it lives on. So the ash borer, which seems to be so effective at killing trees, how does it get the next generation of trees to infect? Are the young trees not susceptible?
That's an excellent question. So that leads into that process of naturalization. And we're a little bit fortunate, I mean, as fortunate as we can be, that it did take about 20 years for it to get from Michigan to here. And so we're able to see and witness, some of those sites back east where we did see that really high mortality and see what's happening. And essentially what's happening is they are depleting their food source, right? And then they need a tree to be about 4 inches in diameter, really, for them to be able to come back and feed. So that's that population break point, is that the problem is they just haven't really exhausted their resources yet in most places because there's just so much ash, especially east. But eventually that does break and the populations break, and hopefully we reach a naturalization process where we find genetically resistant trees that maybe survived that initial, move over of emerald ash borer, and we can propagate trees from those genetics and start planting those out. And that's like 150-year approach. And that's what they did with chestnut and chestnut blight. And they're just now starting to get,
Yeah.
chestnut blight resistant trees. And that's what we hope for long term, because we're not saying ash is going extinct. It's not going to. You're right. They never depleted 100%. But it will take a very long time to get to that naturalization point.
Yeah. Don't you wish you could see how it's going to turn out, Patrick?
Oh yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I would love to be able to see that.
Oh,
Mm,
Patrick's a young
yeah,
guy. He'll be around for a while.
you will.
Yeah, medical advancements, maybe lived 120.
Your comment about firewood, Patrick, was especially concerning. We're here in Pacific County, of course. We're right across the river from Oregon, right?
Yeah.
And of course, because of the popularity of camping, we see a lot of folks bringing their firewood over, right? Because they want to, they're not sure they can buy firewood here, or they're concerned about the cost of firewood and so forth. So it's rather terrifying when we see, trucks come into the campgrounds, right? Full of firewood they're bringing from across the river.
Yeah, yeah, no, it is. And the counties where emerald ash borer has been detected in Oregon are currently under a quarantine. So no one is supposed to be taking anything out of there. It doesn't mean they aren't. And again, that's all just means it's all meant to slow emerald ash borer. It's going to get here and it's going to spread eventually no matter what. But it's all about how can we slow it? Can we give ourselves time and options? But you're right. I mean, it is really hard to see my mother-in-law still takes firewood camping with her, and it drives me nuts. You know, it's hard to drill that through people's heads, but I do think regardless of emerald ash borer, it is good behavior, and it's something that we can start, training kids now, buy it where you burn it. Um, so that in the future we have people on their best behavior when it comes to that kind of stuff.
Other questions, comments for Patrick here? He's got a hard stop at 11, so this is the opportunity to put it out there.
Well, if there's nothing, I just want to plug. I'll put this slide up here so people can have a little bit of time to write things down if they're interested. But I have a number of different ways to stay in touch with the forestry program and my program in general. Newsletter, Forest Overstory podcast. I have a list serve. Someone can just email me directly, and I will add you to my list serve. That I just announce classes and workshops and stuff like that workshop that you mentioned uh, is happening in Eatonville, the forestry field day thing. So.
I also wanted to comment, Patrick, about the uniqueness of ash in terms of how it. I first found my first ash growing natively in a gutter up here. I mean, so it really likes the water, right? And it was a good good clue to clean out the gutters, right?
Yeah, and it's a common mistake is we have all these trees that are known to be water loving, like cedar, for example, but cedar doesn't like it doesn't like its feet wet. It doesn't like to sit in water. Very few trees do. A lot of trees, they like water kind of running through, but it's well drained. They want the water available like we do, but we don't want to sit in it. Um, and ash is one of those exceptions, like willows or cottonwoods. They can sit in some water for a little while and they don't mind it too much. And that's a really special trait that we have to try to replace somehow.
Really want to thank you, Patrick, for joining us here today. This is important information. And mind you, it's especially important to us as master gardeners, right? Because we are indeed reaching out to the public. And so many of the folks approaching us at plant clinics and at our fairs are new to the area. They're coming here from out of state. They're coming out from the east part of the state. So they're very naive relative to what a healthy forest and what a healthy tree lot should look like,
Hmm.
regardless. And I appreciate the comment you made is that a lot of times you're actually thinking about, from an urban forest standpoint, smaller parcels. You're not really thinking about square miles of forest, right? You're looking at parcels.
Yeah, yeah, more and more, that my clientele that seems to be 5 acres and less. So, it's small parcels, but they make up a lot, and they're really important properties to still be stewarding. I want to add too, before I forget, if since you guys are master gardeners, you're working with the public, Kelly, you already put up the link for the Washington Invasive Species Council. If you have a sample that you think may be emerald ash borer, that is the place to take them. They're kind of that first line of defense on confirmation of whether or not what you have is emerald ash borer. And ideally, it's an insect sample in a vial. But a picture can be good, or of course pictures of symptoms on the trees, specifically those D-shaped exit holes, if that's what you think it is.
Other questions, other comments for Patrick? Last call.
No.
Again, Patrick, thank you very much. And thank you for the list of contacts. Again, a shout out to everyone who wants to get on Patrick's list. We spend a lot of time, of course, with that in talking about our vegetables and talking about landscape and horticulture, but silviculture, and it is really an important part of what of the advice and consultation we can provide.
Well, thanks for having me. I like I said, anytime. I love doing these talks. So, and if anyone has any questions, got my email. I'm happy to follow up later.
Good. Patrick, thank you so very much.
Yeah. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
So I want to just again a shout out to the slide you're looking at here. Of course, is this fall forestry day. These are actually fun to go to, and I appreciate it. It'd be a little bit of travel to get up to Eatonville, but I mean it's just they're fun days to go through, and you do learn a lot, in all this. So I want to come back to a couple things. Reminder that I made the correction here to it's 1 p.m. for the Sunday picnic. 1 p.m. next Sunday. So so everyone can and the board meeting tonight at 5 p.m. 5 p.m. tonight, the special time, so we can make sure that we're through our board work ahead of time. I put in the chat, by the way, a number of links relative to relative to Patrick's talk and relative to some of the other sources there. Reminder that there's a tremendous amount of information that's out there regarding these pests and regarding forest health and so forth. Any other comments, perspectives in terms of what Patrick was sharing? Again, I'm struck by how many of our neighbors here coming from typically California are eager to clean up their forest and tidy up their forest, take all the dead wood out, and attempt to make something kind of a pristine English garden like look.
Yeah.
I'm also interested in it. One of the questions I want to follow up with Patrick on is that as many people move in here and they bring new species in, they're introducing new species that are for many blue spruce, for example, bringing them in and planting them, as in an ornate way. And it does that indeed also introduce like the spruce tip bud pest that can affect, so is it the fact that we're bringing in species that are non-native or ornamental, but also inviting other pests that are native to that species to come into the area. So
I think there's a lot of education that needs to happen, maybe within our legislatures too. There used to be some restrictions on what could come into the state, as there are restrictions on what could go into California and Hawaii, for instance. And some of those restrictions have been eradicated. And so there's this free flow of what can be, as you say, Kelly, really potentially harmful stuff. So maybe getting some more rules back would be helpful. But in California, if you had all the ground fires that they have and destroying their houses, they're out in the woods, you'd want the forest floor to be pure mineral, wouldn't you? So that's why they want a clean forest. They don't want a fire.
Mike, you have your hand up.
I had taken a class from Patrick Schultz, the forestry stewardship, and through WSU, and that's where I learned about the forest, what trees I have on my property, and then you have a state forester that'll come out and do a courtesy visit. So that was a very educational opportunity, and that's where I had learned about the creating a wildlife habitat. And I'd sent you a couple pictures where I had some dead Sitka spruce trees that had been dead for many years, and had those cut down 20, 30 feet tall to create a wildlife habitat. And then to put a plug in for the October training session that Ken Bevis, the stewardship wildlife biologist for the state of Washington, will be making a presentation on how to create a wildlife habitat. And then that's where I got the idea for, instead of cutting the trees down to the stump, leave a 20 or 30 foot tall stump. So it worked out very well.
Ken Bevis, by the way, is with DNR and does a phenomenal job in terms of talking about wildlife habitat, in your and wildlife habitat that can be created really just in a landscape in a small backyard environment. You don't need to have acres and acres and acres, right? You can do a lot with a little. And Mike, I want to shout out, those are some great pictures you shared, right, of how you actually kept those snags, right? Those snags are going to become very important habitat. It's often said that when you cut down a tree, right, and you remove a tree from the forest, removing a dead tree from the forest, you're removing half of its useful life. So it takes typically 1 year of decay for every year of growth here in the Northwest, right? So the opportunity of of keeping a tree up there as even as a dead tree is having years and years and years of useful life. 96 species of birds are cavity nesters. 96 species in North America. So anyway, we can go on and on talking about the value of dead wood. So as opposed to dead wood between my ears, right? So other thoughts or comments? We didn't want to extend today's meeting long. We wanted to focus on the continuing education value of it because we do have our board meeting tonight and we have the picnic next Sunday. So we have lots of opportunity for coming together. Okay. Okay. Other comments? Other comments? With that, we will leave you to your day. Thank you all for joining, right? And we will see many of you tonight at the board meeting tonight, Zoom. And we will see you at the picnic next Sunday. Thanks, everyone.